Okay, we're going to begin our first panel. The focus of this panel is framing the issue, and we've asked our speakers to seek to identify characteristics necessary for a nation-to-nation relationship that supports wealth generation. So we're going to proceed in the following manner. I will introduce a speaker, and they will speak for however long they feel is necessary, but maybe not more than 20 minutes. And we'll proceed down the line, and hopefully at the end we'll have time and interest in some questions for our panelists. So leading off is Mary Beth Doucette. Mary Beth is Mi'kmaq who has excelled at scholarship. Her graduate research in the MBA focused on community economic development and First Nations, examining the role of cultural tourism. She engaged in primary research with elders and band members, band administrators at Member 2 in regards to a proposed heritage park. She's a dedicated community volunteer and works as a director, quality assurance and ISO compliance. Mary Beth joined the Purdy Crawford Chair team in 2010 as part of a partnership between Member 2 and Cape Breton University. In 2014, Mary Beth moved into the role of Executive Director of the Purdy Crawford Chair to manage the growth of the business network for Aboriginal youth that had started off as a pilot project in Nova Scotia and gained federal support for an expansion nationally. So if I made any mistakes there, Mary Beth can correct me, but we'll ask her to lead off. Thank you. Okay?
All right. Yeah, so I'm going to use the podium just because I have some notes here that I want to follow along with. So thank you for the introduction. I didn't think that the whole bio was going to be read. So basically, like they said, my name is Mary Beth Doucette, and I work at Cape Breton University. And I am the Executive Director of the Purdy Crawford Chair in Aboriginal Business Studies. And so what I do there is basically work with communities from across the country to talk about how they deal with and manage business issues and governance issues, and help to tell some of the stories to business students who are studying in universities now. And we also we have a project called In Business, and it's a business mentorship network for youth in high school. And we have roughly 200 students a year from across the country who are working and paired with Aboriginal business mentors who are working in their communities and in industry to help them understand what the options are when they go on beyond high school, and hopefully they think about going into business. But our goal is that they at least know that business studies is an option for them. So I'm really grateful to be here and trying to keep the questions in mind about what the frameworks are required to govern, and I guess in order for me to explain why I guess I ended up being invited to come here, I think is in part because of the experience that I've had with working with Member 2. So we've got Team Member 2 sitting at the front of the room here, so I'm really glad that everybody's here and representing, because I started off my career in Aboriginal economic development in Member 2, and I still have my office there, and I'm still there pretty regularly. And most of the learning that I have had about what the issues are and what reconciliation looks like is based in my experience working with Chief Terry and the crowd, all the Chief and Council at Member 2. And basically, what I think I learned most starting out there is that everything is a process. I was in charge of quality assurance when I was there, so process was part of the dialogue. But I had some amazing opportunities while there to work with all the different departments and to work on the governance committee, the community-based governance committee, to create policy and law in the community. And the processes that we went through were an amazing part of that experience. And I think it can be summed up as 3 different phases. So there's the listening part, so listening and learning, reflecting and remembering the past and why we were able to get to where we are right now, and then recognizing that there's a choice. And that's kind of been the process that's keeps running in the back of my mind, I guess, as I move on and work with other people across the country. So an important thing to remember, I think, about that, the process mind. So there's listening, reflecting, and that we have a choice. And that is ingrained, I think, in everything that happens in Member 2. So when I'd go in and talk to council, they would listen, usually, and then I'd get really hard questions. So you knew that they were reflecting on what we were saying. And it was really clear that everyone who was in a decision-making role, who was in leadership, knew that they had a choice. So we appreciate you're giving us this information. We know that we have options, and now we have to make a choice about what we're going to do. And that became so much a part of, like, obviously we're gonna choose what's best for the community, and in order to do that, we have to listen to the community, and we have to reflect on what they're saying, and then make a choice that works for them. And that process is iterative, so it goes over and over and over again, and it's not linear. So you might listen, you might reflect, ask more questions, and listen to the answers, and then you might do that over and over and over again, and decisions that you think should take a couple of weeks end up taking a year. But at the end of the day, you know that it was a good decision. And so I think that's important. That was an important grounding and framing for me in the work that I've gone on to do since, because now that I work with the Crawford Chair at Cape Breton University and we're trying to tell some of these stories about success across the country, I see that the communities that we're talking to and the stories that we're seeing and the ones that are successful and able to do things are following a similar process to what Member 2 does, and that's the listening and the reflecting and the choice and learning as you go along and remembering, like that we did do some good things in the past and we have a lot of strengths here, and it's our choice to take action, and we have to, live with the consequences of that. So we better really listen and really, think about this before we make those decisions. And so in the questions that we were given, and I think they're on the agenda, how do we incent participation and engagement on optional policies, such as investment capacity, additions to reserve, and expedited land claims? It really, I circled the optional piece, because I think sometimes government and government departments and government policies, they forget that it's our choice, right? It's Member 2 has a choice whether or not they want to get invested in these, and we want you to come in and tell us what our choices are and tell us what our options are, but we might choose not to do that, and we might ask you to do something different, and we want you to give us a response and start working with us at that point. So that's the reconciliation point. And so as I was listening to Morley speak, it really, there were so many things that Chief Morley was saying that were resonating with me. And I think what I was hearing him say is like, you got to know your options, and we know we have choices, and there's different deal breakers across the country, so one policy is not going to fit for everyone. One set of options or one pathway is not going to be the same for everyone. The communities know what their deal breakers are, and so if you start talking to and teaching about what some of the options are and listening when we're writing these policies to what the community actually wants or what communities need, and they'll tell you what the deal breakers are. One of the things that Morley said that really stands out is, we'll call you. Like, when we're ready, we'll make the choice and we'll call you. And you better answer the phone when we do, and be ready to react and respond, because by that point we'll know what we're asking for, and we'll know what our choice has been. And I think the third question that's there, how can wealth creation be used to support reinvestment in capacity? I underlined support because it's not force. You can't force us to abide by the policies that you're writing down or by the structures that are there. If there are pieces that work for us, we'll adapt them. And if there are things that don't work for us, we'll choose to remove those things, which was probably some of the hardest things that I had to do at Member 2, was listen to councillors when they said, we don't want to do that part. We want everything else, but we don't want these 3 pieces, so take them out. It's like, it's an all or nothing deal. It's nothing's ever all or nothing. We have choice in this. And I think what I'm seeing across the country is the communities that are most successful are the ones that recognize that they have choice, and everybody doesn't know that. And so I think what we can do, or what the government can do, is to help support programs that allow communities to learn what the options are, but you also have to listen to what communities are saying and learn from them as well, reflect on what's being said, and then make your choice and take action. So, yeah, I think that's, I don't know how much time that was, but I don't have anything else to say right now, other than, is Morley still here? No? He was talking about going forward and making changes and being able to tell people what you want to do. One of the things in Halifax that, once I realized it really drives me nuts, is when you go to Pier 21. I don't know if anybody who's visiting Halifax is going to go to Pier 21. It's just across the street. But the last couple times that I was there, it drives me crazy, because it's all about Canada welcoming visitors and welcoming immigrants and people coming and welcoming, but there's no indication of who welcomed the Canadians. It's like, hello, we're in Mi'kmaq territory. Like, where are the Mi'kmaq welcoming the world pieces of that should be at Pier 21? So if anybody has Morley's ear, or has the ear of people that can make a change there, that would be one of my suggestions. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next presenter is David Paul, and David has a fairly short kind of resume here. He's a member of the Maliseet Nation at Thoppil in New Brunswick. He is president of the Aboriginal Resource Consultants, Atlantic Canada's largest Aboriginal consulting firm. He has an extensive background in First Nations issues, specifically economic development, communications, and government and corporate relations. He served as deputy chair of the Indian Taxation Advisory Board, if I got that right, from 2003 to 2005. And as the Atlantic representative from 1989 to 2007, and he's currently Deputy Chief Commissioner of the First Nations Tax Commission. So I give you David Paul.
Thanks, Scott. If I could just ask everybody to please stand. Take a moment and stand. All right, you can sit down now. So. That's compliance. That's compliance. That's what we've been doing since the development of the Indian Act, and government has been telling us what to do and how to do it. And it's also what we do when we pay our taxes, which I'm a big fan of, is taxation. As you know, I don't know if you've looked at that bio that they sent. I've really got to talk to my office. I looked at that as one of the cheesiest photos of myself. There's probably other ones, but that should never have been released. You know, I want to talk to you. I want to thank you for inviting me and coming to attend what I think is a very important questions that have to be asked of ourselves. And I will read my prepared notes, but I was talking in the lobby there with a couple of friends, and that it's, as Morley suggested, I had dinner with Morley last night, and we got to talking about this window of opportunity. And the day after the election of this current government, that window started to close. And Morley's correct that we have to take advantage of this. In all of the discussions or speeches from the Minister of Justice to other ministers, is that it's up to us to determine and to decide where we want to be. What is our position in terms of the Canadian Federation, and where we want to go? Do we want to be compliant and stand when told to stand and sit when told to sit, or kneel? It reminds me of church. I was brought up a Catholic, but I don't want to be compliant. I want us to thrive. I want us to achieve more and to garner more, to understand more. In my discussions with my friends, we were talking about the language, our vernacular, the vernacular of government and Indian affairs. It's all about programming. Now we have to switch and remove ourselves from that activity and to think about other bigger questions. Who are we? What is our place in this society? Where do we sit? What rules, what laws do we develop for ourselves? Who will be our members, our citizens of our nations? What is our nation? Who's in our nation? Nation is defined, and I'll get to this, but I'll finish my little ad lib here. But we've got a lot of questions that we have to answer ourselves as a Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia. Is it the group in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq? Or do they include Newfoundland? Or do they include Quebec? Or do they include New Brunswick as the Mi'kmaq nation? How do they go about discussing this with Canada? How do we determine the Maliseets in the United States, throughout New Brunswick, in Quebec? So we have all these questions to ask ourselves, and it's up to us to come up with the answers, not somebody else, not Ottawa, not Perry at the FN in Ottawa, or even the tribal council heads, or it's up to us, the leaders who are here, and I see a few. But we have to decide this. And now I will go on with my prepared notes. What are nation-to-nation relations? There's been a lot of discussion about what constitutes a nation-to-nation relationship. I would just say one thing in very plain spoken way: a nation has three attributes. First, and most important, is territory or land. Second, has jurisdictions over that territory, and the ability to pass law, to create statute, to tax, to derive revenue from that jurisdiction, that territory. Now, I know that, and I was perhaps at fault for years being brought up believing that this is my land on my reserve. Well, it's not. Legally, it is not. We do not own our land. We are what can be referred to as legal minors. And there's only the courts have defined what a legal minor is. and you're either mentally incompetent or you're under the age of 18. But we, through the Indian Act, are legal minors. We have no say as to how we proceed. We have no say. We have no land. The land is not ours. It is held in trust for us because we haven't the ability to have our own land. So this has to change. But those three things are necessary in order to define ourselves as a nation. They're necessary because nation to nation occurs when both parties are masters of their respective domains. There are aspects of government where they have the say. They say that say cannot be unilaterally overturned and cannot be coerced by the other party's control of revenue and resources or money. Nation to nation requires full fiscal powers and revenue-based fiscal relationship. Nation-to-nation relations requires that First Nations have the ability to raise their own revenues. This doesn't mean that we continue with our hand out asking government to fund programs to keep our people busy for part of the year. This means to create and to have our own resources and revenues. Nation-to-nation relations also requires neither government can unilaterally reduce the revenues of another so that the OSR policy does not kick in. We therefore need a fiscal relationship that provides us with real fiscal powers and reduces the potential of the other government to cap those revenues, that prevents them from clawing them back or to subject them to transfer offsets. A transfer is not a fiscal power. Transfers are necessary when you don't have fiscal powers. To maintain our current state of relationship is to maintain somebody in control of us. The Fiscal Management Act, which myself and others were involved in, I think it's about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer than that. We've built the nucleus of a nation-to-nation relationship through that Fiscal Management Act. We call it the Local Revenue Account. This framework provides First Nations with considerable scope for service innovation, while at the same time creating third-party oversight and verification in respect to the needs of the conventions that define the country's social and economic union. The local revenue account is a set of fiscal powers and related expenditure responsibilities. Its revenues include property tax and some other revenues like development cost charges, business activities tax, and in some cases, property transfer taxes. So far, there have been no transfer offsets, caps, or other governments taxing these revenues. These are our own revenues. When it comes to responsibilities, we determine the priorities, we design the services, we make the investments in the infrastructure with these responsibilities. We do this without the oversight or conditions of other governments. This is us generating our own revenue, making decisions, and applying those decisions and bringing about real change within our communities. The First Nations Management Act, or Fiscal Management Act, has shown a way to improve our communities. An independent evaluation called the FMA one of the most successful First Nations institutions in Canada. There has been considerable improvement in governments and economies. The communities that are involved now are centers of innovation. Many of these communities have been able to make considerable improvements in their infrastructure and services. The Fiscal Management Act has grown quite fast in comparison to other initiatives. There are now over 220 First Nations participating in just 10 years. There's a typo in my notes. Over First Nations have received a financial certification. I don't know how many that is, but there's got to be over 70. But the financial certification is part of the FMA, or the Fiscal Management Act, in which we certify those communities that have a financial ability to account for their monies and have demonstrated that responsibility. Over $400 million has been raised in debentures and $1 billion in new investments on First Nation lands. This is not Indian Affairs money. This is not a government program money. This is our government acting like governments. These improvements have created what will be called a virtuous circle of wealth creation, and it works as follows. First, improved investment leads to improved revenues. Second, improved revenues lead to improved services, infrastructure, and governance. And this increases investment again, and the cycle goes around. Nation-to-nation relationship needs to be based on First Nations having more independent authorities that are funded by independent revenues. This development should be supported by First Nations institutions that can work with our communities to build their capacities, provide economies of scale, and to ensure a smooth integration with other Canadian governments. The Fiscal Management Act model provides a ready-made solution. For example, the First Nations Tax Commission has supported the negotiation of 20 tax-based service agreements between First Nations and their neighbor jurisdictions. The net result has been improved cooperation and greater efficiency for both parties, all parties. We have had 150 students go through the Tétrault School of Indigenous Economics, which is a program or a school that we had created from the First Nations Tax Commission to deal with some of those questions that we've never had taken the time to understand before and ask ourselves and come up with the solutions. The Tétrault School of Indigenous Economics is where they learn applied economics. They are learning the fundamentals of building an economy. It should be expanded so that more revenues and responsibilities are brought into the local revenue account. They can be brought into the same system of financial reporting and be provided with training and other support as necessary. Increased revenues will mean that more First Nations will be able to take advantage of the Fiscal Management Act. This is going to incentivize more First Nations to participate in the FMA. The increased revenues will accelerate the ability of the current successful Fiscal Management Act First Nations to develop their communities, economies, and governance. Moving more decision-making power to our homes will reduce the scope of federal oversight, reduce the administrative burden of that relationship, and foster more innovation for our communities and our people. As I said, and I just want to close that this window of opportunity is closing and will continue to close. It may open up again, we don't know. I didn't think Trump would be elected in the United States, but strange things happen. With that, thank you.
Thank you, David. And our last panelist is Jeff Cole. We got to thank Jeff because he's stepping in for his ADM boss at the last minute. He's Director of Lands and Economic Development for Indigenous Affairs and Northern Development. I don't know too much about Jeff, but I see online that he's got a long history with Indigenous Affairs, and prior to that worked with Health Canada. So Jeff, come on up.
Damn LinkedIn page. Yes, well, thanks for having me. Thanks to the Institute on Governance and the Canadians for a New Partnership, and thanks for having me here on Mi'kmaq territory. It's a real pleasure to be here. As mentioned, I wasn't planning to speak today, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about wealth creation. Just a side story, I used to work in Ottawa. I used to work in headquarters in lands and economic development with Alan Clerk, who many of you probably know. You don't have to take his picture. We did not plan that. Anyways, I was working in Ottawa, and I had a conversation with the RDG, Chris McDonnell, and he invited me to come work out in the region. And the idea of coming to work in a regional office to create wealth with Indigenous communities was something that I could not pass up. So that's how I ended up moving from Ontario to work in an Atlantic Region office and be here with you today. Obviously, Sheila Murphy sends her regrets. She really wanted to be here, but due to things happening back in Ottawa, she wasn't able to make it. So I did commit to her to follow up with her and share some of the results of our conversations and some of the next steps, as you will, for the session. Being new to the region, I wanted to pick up a little bit just right out of the gate on what the regional chief was saying around that old narrative. I can say since I arrived in the region in February, I can honestly feel a real on-the-ground shift from that old narrative to a new narrative. And that narrative includes people wanting to work and support and advance the goals and aspirations expressed by the Prime Minister, by the regional chief this morning, and by many others over the last 2 years since the current government was elected. There is a real willingness to make advances and progress on these issues. I've sat in numerous conversations with representatives and officials from provincial governments, cities, towns, non-governmental organizations, the federal government, not just in Indigenous affairs, but across the federal sort of group, if you will. And there is a commitment to make change and to really advance these goals. And we understand and appreciate the aspirations. The trick is, so how do we get there? And that's sort of the challenge. And I'm in a unique situation where I have the unenviable task of implementing the Indian Act to create wealth, but also to help and support First Nations move beyond the Indian Act if that's something they wish to do. And just to build on the points of Mary Beth earlier, it is really about choice, and it's about reflecting the aspirations of what Indigenous groups and First Nations want, and then using those aspirations to achieve the goals that we know folks want to realize. So anyways, what I thought I would do with this few minutes that I have is basically divide the conversation into two bits. The first bit is to highlight some of the issues or challenges, frame the issue, if you will. I think that was one of the things we were asked to do. And then respond to some of those challenges with some ideas that I think, well, I have, but I think that are shared fairly widely within the federal government around how we can move beyond the current situation. And those pieces would then provide maybe a starting point or a bit of the framework. So these are not exhaustive lists. I did come up with 14 points, but it's not exhaustive. There's a fair bit there. There will definitely be things that I will have missed. So first of all, people have already spoken quite eloquently to the concept of nation to nation, and I wouldn't disagree with any of those ideas. So I would begin with the idea of wealth creation. And wealth creation is a goal. If it was easy to do, we'd all be where we want to be. We'd all have the income and the wealth that we desire. We've had governments, organizations, communities for lifetimes working on creating wealth. There is no silver bullet. There is no panacea. There is no switch you flick and all of a sudden everybody becomes wealthy. Even in the current situation that we are working in right now, there are some communities under some regimes that are doing very successful, and there are other communities on other regimes that aren't doing as successful. So there is not one silver bullet that's going to help us create the wealth that we're searching for. So for me, it's a combination of a number of things. And in no particular order, I'll maybe just start going through some of the ideas. First, having worked in Ottawa in the lands and economic development sector, and having worked in the lands administration in addition to reserve area, a couple of things became pretty clear very quickly, and that is there's got to be some sort of clear separation between business and politics. Because the business environment, business people want to be able to pursue their initiatives free of that kind of political interference. There's a couple of other principles that are fundamental to investors. One, they want predictability. They want to understand where their project and where their investment is going. If that is not clear, then it's going to be very difficult to attract investment. They also want certainty. They don't want to investors don't want to put their money in places where it may not survive or realize the investment results that they're achieving. So they want a level of certainty. And the final point I want to mention here is the concept of clarity. And this is where, in part, we need to do a lot more work. If anybody's ever called the department and asked for the 1 to 10 steps on how to do a lease under the Indian Act, you may be surprised to know that we don't have a pamphlet that we hand out to you and say, here's how you do the designation and how that results in the lease. Here's the timeline, here's the steps, here's what's expected of you, here's what's expected of us, and here we go. By the end of the day, we're going to have a lease arrangement. That doesn't exist. That clarity scares business people, or that lack of clarity scares businesses. So what we need to do is bring that clarity back to the work that we're doing. Another key aspect is the fundamental importance of land. Land for many communities across the country is a very key resource. People obviously are important resources for communities, but after that, land is very important. I've worked a lot with folks across the country out west, and the thing that I noticed as soon as I moved into this region is that the land holding is very small. Communities don't have vast acreage or hectares of land that other communities have across the country. So number one, we have to add land to reserve. That's part of my job as Director of Lands and Economic Development, is to promote and facilitate additions to reserve. Increasing that land base is key. Once we have the land base, we have to do what many cities and municipalities do and communities across the country do, and that is develop plans for how that land is going to be used. Those plans are often developed with communities so that we understand where you want your business sector, where you want your residential sector, where you want your waste disposal facilities, your schools, and so on. So planning the land is really important. After that is activating it. Where do you put the infrastructure? Where are the pipings going to go? Where is the businesses? Attracting investors to the community. So activating it is very important. And then finally, monitor and managing the land, understanding that their interests and land holdings in various registries. People want to understand where they can find their particular property interest holding. So there's got to be a registry, and then there's monitoring, making sure people are using the land in the ways that people understood it to be. So this facility over here isn't now recycling paint, for example, in a residential area. So monitoring and managing the land is very important. The next series of points I want to make, I'm not going to touch on too much because Mary Beth did it already, and that is relating to community choice and decisions. First Nations are the ones with the power and the authority to decide and direct what they want to have done on their land. I work in the Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, soon to be Indigenous Services Canada. What we do is we respond as best we can to the requests and the demands of First Nations. Whether it's a lease, a program, or a service, we're there to try and help work in partnership with communities. But we don't do that based on our own ideas. That direction comes from communities. And that brings to another point, the essential importance of governance. Community governance and building and establishing and maintaining governance structures and processes is essential. I've had a number of conversations with chiefs across the region, and they've said to me things like, you know, as soon as we got our HR policies, our financial policies, our planning policies, and all that work established, we were able to see a pathway to the success that we're now able to have a conversation on buying additional land, buying into other business opportunities. So that underlying governance along with community choice and direction is fundamental. Included in all this is the concept of capacity. We have a complicated system right now, but even if it wasn't what it is today, business arrangements are complicated. I'll give you a couple of examples. How many people here have had the opportunity to negotiate a lease with Costco or Home Depot or any big company like that? You know, that kind of negotiation is complex. It takes time, and you need to be able to have the kind of discourse with the entrepreneurs and with those companies to support the result. How many people have had an opportunity to complete an ATR? Everyone knows they take a long time. There are some really complicated steps there. Everything from understanding environmental impacts to negotiating third-party interests with folks like Nova Scotia Power, New Brunswick Power. This is not introductory land management type of stuff. How many folks have had the opportunity to negotiate revenue sharing or royalty agreements with the provinces? Again, complicated negotiations. And then when we're moving beyond the Indian Act, we get to do simple things like develop our own land codes. And that is a lot of effort. It takes a lot of planning and engagement and participation by community members. Not just anybody has got this basket of tools or experiences to help us do this. So we have to work together. We have to invest in building capacity, and we have to do it together because there is no simple solution. Access to capital is an issue that I've heard about over and over again over the last few months since joining the region. It's either not easy to get, or it doesn't come when people need it, or there's just not enough. So we have to find ways to get at the access to capital challenge. We had some very interesting conversations with the folks at Jedi last week, where they were explaining to me that if there was just 20 grand available to this entrepreneur, that would help that person start what could potentially be a multi-$100,000 million initiative. But they don't have access to that first 20,000. So we need to find ways to get them that kind of resource. And that means establishing new types of partnerships with all of the federal government departments, but also the provincial and municipal governments. It means bringing in the banking sector, working more closely with the Aboriginal financial institutions and other private sector investments, whether they're big companies or sort of angel donors. We have to find a way to be able to bring in more capital to these conversations. And finally, I couldn't talk about challenges without at least mentioning the Indian Act once. The Indian Act, as we all know, was not designed to promote and facilitate economic development. I'll try and get this right, but a good friend of mine often says the Indian Act is the most successful anti-business legislation ever written. And if you know who said that, then you know who I'm talking about, and you would agree with me, and you would probably agree with him. But in addition to the fact that the Indian Act presents new ways of doing business that don't exist off reserve, it also adds a layer of service from the department that is required to be able to help First Nations realize their aspirations. And if you've called the department and you've asked for some help on an issue, you know that the staff that we have on our teams are trying to work with everybody at the same time. So there's that layer of service that needs to be improved. And I think that this announcement to move toward an Indigenous Services Canada is one way where we'll be able to help facilitate business a little bit more easily. Because the Indian Act presents the barriers that it does, we have a whole host of legislative and opt-in options that I'll talk about in a second. So those are some of the challenges or some of the issues I think that might frame some of this conversation. Maybe I'll take a few minutes now and just talk about some of the elements that might exist as part of a framework to move beyond some of these challenges, to promote the nation-to-nation aspiration that we're working toward, and to create wealth at the same time. First, I think there are at least 3 guiding principles for this framework. One is it has to be community-led, community-driven, and must reflect the community aspirations. So that community choice element, again, is essential as a key guiding principle. Next, First Nation governments, Indigenous governments need to have the authority over the levers of government to make the decisions and do the things that they want to do. Next, living in democracy, we want to ensure that this framework is guided by principles of accountability, transparency, values, and ethics, and those other elements of democratic institutions. So I jotted down 7 items that I believe could be present in this framework for wealth creation. First, to jump right on the point that David had made, jurisdiction and control is a key starting point. First Nations are best placed to set their direction and drive their vision. So we need to support increased access and control to those levers of government. And some of the things that were previously mentioned, whether it's planning, spending, taxation, other avenues of revenue creation, with this sort of control, First Nations will be able to decide their direction for themselves. We have a whole host of programs and resources, financing available, existing in various federal programs across the federal government. They exist in INAC, they exist in DFO, Environment Canada, and so on. We have to find ways to make those resources sustainable, and we need to find ways to make those resources more easily accessible. And that may include moving beyond the current funding and transfer payment policy processes that currently exist. And I believe those conversations are underway. Education and capacity, as previously mentioned, has got to be a key part of this equation. Whether it's education in the sense of K-12, post-secondary education, we have to continue to make those investments. As mentioned, we have to invest in the youth because the youth are our future, and the best way to do that is to help provide the support and education services that they'll need to participate in the modern economy. On the capacity side, wealth creation often starts with a job. So we have a number of programs and initiatives underway that are intended to help support community members access the labor market. And we need to continue to do that because a job today is a future for a family tomorrow. And that's part of the way that we're looking at our programs. If we can support a project that's going to bring 20 jobs into a community, well, then that's a good step because it's helping to build the capacity not only for the people doing the jobs, but also for the community overall. I've talked about this already. Partnerships are key, and as I said at the beginning, there is a willingness like I have not seen in a really, really long time for organizations and governments, whether they're provincial, federal, or First Nation, Indigenous governments, to work together to advance these goals. And it's not just governments. There's a whole host of non-governmental organizations, support organizations, universities, community colleges. Everybody wants to be in on this agenda and supporting this. So we need to find ways to strengthen those organizations to participate in these partnerships, but also to fund the partnerships. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. Habitat for Humanity is doing some amazing things in some communities across the country, across the region, to construct and build homes for folks. Those are the kinds of relationships we can build on. Of course, policy changes are things that we can do. There's big policy changes and there's small policy changes. Sometimes the small policy changes go unnoticed but can have significant impact. To give you an example, we recently changed leasing policy so that a lockatee lessee would be able to establish their own rent levels. If you can imagine, up to a couple of years ago, that wasn't possible. The department had to establish the rent level for a lockatee lessee. There are other changes, whether it's the Indian monies policy and accessing the 64 Section 1 changes as a way for First Nations to manage their own Indian monies within their trusts under their own controls. There's a gigantic appetite right now for these policy ideas. What are the things that the federal government can be doing to further improve how we're creating wealth and supporting the nation-to-nation dialogue? We're often asked within the department, what's something we can do? If you have an idea, there is an absolute thirst to have that idea brought forward and understood so that we can explore and potentially make changes to support this program. We also have a whole host of legislative and opt-in programs that can help move beyond the Indian Act and help create wealth. Many of you know about the First Nations land management regime. It was referenced in the paper that was produced in advance of the event. That is an opportunity for First Nations to remove themselves from the 32 sections of the Indian Act as it relates to land management and take control over their own affairs and their own decision-making processes for land management. We also have things like the First Nations Commercial Industrial Development Act, which is a tool that exists to help us address many of the regulatory and legislative gaps that are evident in the Indian Act. To go back to my earlier points about certainty and clarity and predictability, investors want that kind of, those kind of concepts evident in securing their investments. So the First Nations Commercial Industrial Development Act brings forward provincial laws that allow and provide for that certainty for investors. And there are communities out west, such as the Muskowgan First Nation in Saskatchewan, that have used the First Nation Commercial Industrial Development Act to great benefit to help advance some of their projects related to potash development. Of course, we had mentioned the FMB and the value and support that they bring, so I won't go into mentioning that. Finally, a key part of this framework for me would have to be investing in First Nation institutions. Those institutions are the organizations that can drive forward and advance the agenda much better than a federal government department. Whether it's the First Nations Land Advisory Board or the National Aboriginal Land Managers Association or an institution that may support infrastructure, there has to be more investment in advancing First Nation control over concepts such as land, environment, and infrastructure. So maybe with that, I'll leave it there. I probably went on a little bit longer than I was supposed to. I'm sure I'll get tons of questions. I may even get a call from Ottawa regarding some of my comments. If I don't see you again, thank you very much.
Okay, so we'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience. But before we go there, I just want to give Jeff's fellow panelists an opportunity. Any comments on what Jeff has to say before we go to the, no?
Well,
No, yeah.
you asked the question.
No, you can sit there.
No, and I appreciate a lot of the comments, what Jeff is saying, but I want to, I guess, just state that we have to move beyond where we are at right now, and to do away with this idea of programs, do away with this idea of going to Ottawa, going to Indian Affairs. Our thinking has to be about us as nations now. How do we reestablish our nation, our governments, and what is the role of that? And I participate. The deputy chief commissioner of a institution that does a lot of good work, but again, it's not my nation's. It's not my nation's government work. And those are the things that we've got to start doing and thinking about, is moving beyond all of this that we're used to, and to really go back to what we had a couple hundred years ago, where our relationship with Canada was one of a military alliance, one of friendship, one of joint benefit. And never forget, we got to own our own land. That's it.
Mary Beth, any comments, or go to the?
It's working now? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree with the fact that we need to talk about governance. And I don't know if I mentioned that enough when I spoke to, like, the experience that we had at Member 2, the processes take a long time. It means listening to the community and recognizing that we have to define, like, who are we, what do we do, who is our membership, why are we doing all of this stuff, and what's important to us. And I think as I was just sitting here listening and thinking, as we're framing the issue, and I know we're talking about economic reconciliation, and what I really appreciate about what was in this document is the fact that governance was such an important part of the economic reconciliation piece. And maybe I spend too much time at universities, but I guess from a theoretical perspective, like, I don't know if we're really thinking enough about what an economy is and what economy means. And just as an example, one of the we have somebody that works in Mi'kmaq territory, Clifford Paul, who's a Cape Breton University grad, but he works as the moose manager for Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources. And he said a couple of years ago something that really sticks with me about, like, moose hunting licenses and how much they cost. And when you compare the less than $100, I don't know what a moose hunting license is, it's less than $100. But when you compare how much meat comes from a moose and how much economic benefit can come from that, and yet we're undervaluing so many of the resources that are here, recognize that those are resources, those are economic resources that we have. And I guess one other point that I didn't make, but I was thinking about earlier, was keeping that in mind. When one of the projects that we did, we wrote a textbook on Indigenous business and principles and practices in Canada. And it was a long process, and it's not perfect by any means. But for me, the important part of that textbook was the very first chapter. When you write the story of what is the history of business in Canada, don't start in 1600, start a whole lot further back and recognize that there were economies here happening, operating, and organized that were working in many economies across the country, lots of them, and we have to recognize they're still operating and we can learn from them. So I think, yeah, those are the things that are running through my mind. Yes, we have policy changes, we have things we have to do. We have to think bigger questions than what we are right now.
All right, thank you both. Out to the audience. Marcia, you got a question, and then there's the one at the back there.
Hi, I'm Marcia Nickerson, and I wrote the paper leading into this, but also the summaries coming out of it. So I've been at all of these events, and the two things I've heard most often are we need to change the own source revenue clawback policy, and we need to invest in First Nation institutions. So I've been hearing this for a year, and I have no idea if anything is happening or underway, whether, I know there's a lot of tables at high levels right now talking about these issues, but are any of you aware of what's being done on the OSR policy, or if anything is being done currently, as well as I've heard many ministers talk about even investments in institutions, and I don't know that it's happening, or is it something we can say is currently happening, or that's what we plan on doing?
Anybody want to go ahead?
I do have some information. Not all. The First Nations Tax Commission has been told we have proposed the development of an infrastructure institute, which would be a national application to look after all infrastructure within our communities across Canada. They've agreed to provide for the seed funding to begin that process. There are a number of groups that are dealing with specific items. I guess in looking at taking away from or removing bits and pieces of the Indian Act and assuming more control. And as you know, that none of this stuff is overnight. I guess the most difficult audience to convince will be our own people, because we've known nothing for generations, have known nothing else, and we have a sense of the Act also acts as a bit of a security blanket for us, because we can see it, we can understand it, we can read it, and it's applied. And so it's changes are happening. Nothing is quick, but people are talking about it and are asking the questions now.
Any other? Sure, go ahead, Jeff.
Just on the idea of the institutions, there isn't a national program that exists that's called Let's Make Institutions. They emerge from, or efforts for institution building are emerging from communities and organizations across the country. And if you have a desire or an interest to advance the concept of an institution, I think all we have to do is begin that dialogue, because I've heard the minister talk about the importance of institutions many times, but they, as mentioned, they don't happen overnight, and they don't happen without people actually doing the heavy lifting and all the work to create them. So there is definitely possibility on the institution side.
We are attempting to I guess, breathe life back into the First Nations Statistical Institute that was had its knees cut off, and I guess that had a very sorry life experience. That was part of the original First Nations Statistical Management Act. Now statistical is out of there after they pulled the funding on that. But we are trying to bring that back. As you know, information is invaluable. We traditionally do not participate to a great extent in surveys and census that Stats Can puts out, and so that for that reason we do not have a lot of information which is necessary for us to make decisions to ensure investment. We don't know what our gross domestic product is from a lot of our communities. We still guess at what the unemployment rates are. We don't know. There's so much we don't know about ourselves, and that's why that institution in particular is very important.
No one ever wants to
Well, I think we can say that the Institute on Governance is actually doing some work on behalf of the Department of Indigenous Affairs and the Assembly of First Nations, and they are actively discussing the development of a new fiscal relationship. And I believe that I too could be fired by the time I get home, but I do believe that the question of own source revenue is going to come up in those discussions. We haven't been involved in research on it, but I'm pretty sure it's on the table, Marcia.
Just a,
So,
just a point of fact. So, and I'm not a public servant. So the government did change its OSR policy for self-governing First Nations in June of 2017.
Yeah.
And so it's been suspended for 3 years pending the negotiation of a new self-government fiscal policy framework.
okay, we've got another question. Could you identify yourself, sir?
Yeah, my name's Ken Paul. I work with the Atlantic Policy Congress. And I got sort of three things that I want to get commentary on. First of all, as David mentioned, we have to start thinking a little bit differently, but the conversations that we've had today are all talking about on-reserve land, and land base is important for economics, for a lot of economics, but I don't know if there's an appetite within the Department of Indian Affairs to think beyond reserve lands with respect to business support. I know we talk about additions to reserves, but that's still the same thing. So that's the first thing about land. The second thing, the largest retailer in the world, the two largest retailers are Alibaba and Amazon. The largest taxi service in the world is Uber. The largest hotelier in the world is Airbnb. These are all virtual economies. I wanted to know what kind of opportunities are there for First Nations in the virtual economies. And the third thing that wasn't mentioned was industry. We didn't talk about partnerships with industry or corporate social responsibility. And I wondered if somebody could make comments on that as well.
On the, I guess, moving beyond our reserves, the First Nations Tax Commission is pursuing what we're referring to as, before somebody changed the name, and we were calling it the Aboriginal Resource Tax. And what we are attempting to do is to gain jurisdiction in areas where there is resource development within our traditional territories that will allow us to tax that activity. And those revenues would go back into our governments to help run our governments and look after our members. It's a fair piece of work. We've got to convince the provincial governments to give up jurisdiction that they've had for the last couple hundred years. We've got to convince the federal government to compensate the provincial governments, and we've got to convince ourselves as Indians to do this, to go after more and more jurisdiction. That I can comment on.
Jeff, do you want to comment on that?
I could comment on the industry question.
Sure.
So as I mentioned, partnerships are key, and as many people will know, one of our particular challenges are keeping up with communities that have partnerships with industry. So very often we'll receive phone calls from communities saying, I've got a partnership with X company, we could do this, can you help us get that done? So industry is a really key partner in all of this. I'd also add that the financial sector is a key part. And the financial sector is already involved and participating in the Indigenous economy. Some banks are quicker to the game, so to speak, than others. I was happy to hear that Scotiabank is having some interesting conversations. So industry and the financial sector are key partners for sure.
Anybody got any comments on the virtual economy? Have we got any First Nations that are working in that area?
I don't know of, the companies you refer to, they're essentially disruptors. That's how they get their foothold. That's how they change the way people look. They've disrupted the norm. They've disrupted an industry and have met with great success. Are we doing that in an organ? I really don't know. I've often thought about the need for us to change the trajectory of our communities and our kids and our education, to go, into more areas where we traditionally have not. So I guess I would like to see us disrupt other industries and be part of that and disrupt, much like we're doing with government now, disrupting this relationship. And if it could be virtual, even better, but there's nothing that I know of.
I think, okay. Yeah, so I think building on that idea of virtual disruption, I don't know about, I think what Ken's talking about is how do we incent people to open businesses online or learn about what it means to open businesses online and how to do that. And I think there's probably, coming from the university sector, there's probably somebody that wants to research that and would love to, take that on and do that. And maybe we should go to somebody to get some funding to do that. But I think in the post-TRC commission era that we're in, the biggest opportunity that I see for online disruption from our communities right now is the opportunity to educate and the opportunity to share messages. And Chief Morley, he's on the ball. He's going to start making videos in order to share the stories and let people know, because the public are the ones that need to learn. And thus far, it's not easy for people publicly to learn and consume and make it accessible. But at CBU, some of you may have heard, about 2 years ago, we offered a course. It was called Mi'kmaq 2701, Learning from Knowledge Keepers of Mi'kma'ki. And that it's still able to be viewed online through archives. But when that was launched, it was a class. We wanted to show that we heard some of the things that had been said in the TRC, and show that, we're going to make information accessible to anybody who wants to hear it. And so we made this class that was going to be offered at CBU, available online. And the instructors, Stephen Augustine and Ashley Consola-Willocks, they thought, we might get 100, maybe 125 people tune in weekly to watch and talk to us and tell us what they're thinking about. And if you didn't hear the story of this experience, it ended up being, we shut down all the servers in CBU when we opened up for registration. It ended up being, thousands of people wanted to hear what was going on, and they were tuning in weekly by the thousands, just to hear from our knowledge keepers, our storytellers, see the examples, see what's going on. And it's an opportunity that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So we had Mi'kmaq people from across the country who normally don't, on a day-to-day basis, don't get to hear the stories because they're working in other provinces or whatever, or other countries. But we also had people from China and India and wherever, recognizing, wow, this is a really cool story of Indigenous and Indigenous storytelling, and it's something that resonates with me because we do the same thing in our community. So I guess from thinking broadly about changing the economy, if education is the first piece of changing the economy, then the social opportunity, the social media opportunity is to be able to disrupt the controllers of that knowledge, and there's an opportunity there.
Any other questions? Yes, I've got two, one at the back and one over here. Barry's coming at the back there. Put your hand up, sir, again. There, yeah, that's it.
Thank you. My name is Brian Adair. I'm a lawyer here in Halifax. Not a constitutional expert by any means. I did study it 29 years ago in law school. But it seems to me that when you're looking at a country like Canada, and we're talking about reconciliation and really fixing problems, that you can't help but go back to our fundamental constitutional documents. And in the paper, as I was reading it a few minutes ago, there's discussion about Meech Lake and, you know, the failed attempts. And I asked Bob Ray this at a conference here a couple of years ago in Ottawa. And what about constitutional change? Where does that fit in? Have we lost any hope at all of that? Because it seems to me as a lawyer, if you want stable funding, then the most stable funding is to entrench it in the Constitution in some way. We do have Section 35, which protects Aboriginal rights. And so perhaps the thinking now is maybe we can kind of backdoor a lot of stuff. If we have a treaty, then it's automatically protected under Section 35, but we know there again, reasonableness and the ability of government to take away some of these rights are embedded in Section 35 as the courts interpret that. So I guess my question is what do people, you know, do we see constitutional change as an end goal? In other words, we reach a point where everybody in Canada says, oh gosh, yes, if we really want reconciliation, we really understand this now, it's a no-brainer. We have to entrench funding, we have to entrench land base in the Constitution, or is it something that we should be working towards directly? I'm not sure if that's a clear question, but I guess your thoughts on constitutional change, whether it follows societal change, whether it can drive it, what should we be doing? Should we just be ignoring it? Should we rely on Section 35?
Oh, firstly, I don't think, or at least I know that I do not aspire to constitutional funding. I aspire to generating my own funds, my own revenues, and as a government, not relying upon the Constitution for more, for someone to supply me with funds. I think that we need the tools to generate our own revenues and rely upon ourselves, not some other government, not somebody else. The Section 35 exists. That's our portion. Canada will be, I don't think in my lifetime they're going to reopen the constitutional discussions to change the Constitution. The Section 35 is essentially an empty box, and it's been referred to that, and it's up to us to fill it. Well, it being up to us to fill it, I see the sky as a limit. And I want everything that is necessary for us to thrive and to succeed as a government, as a people, within this Federation of Canada as part of Section 35. I don't want somebody somewhere else saying, here's some money, you know, I'm going to look after you. I want to look after myself. And I think that there's a number of communities out there who are past being the ward, the legal minor, that we want to lead ourselves.
Yeah, I'm not supposed to comment. I'm the moderator, but I will say that there are some of us who would like to see legislative change. You know, I mean, we recognize that constitutional change may be a ways out, but we would like to see some legislative change. And I come back to David's point, which I think is very, you know, significant. Some of us would like to see this forward momentum anchored in legislative change, and yet the window is closing. Not only the political window, if you think in terms of the next election and what could happen, we may hope that it doesn't, but also the legislative window. You know, people say to me that if legislation isn't tabled by next spring, it's not going to pass in this mandate. And some of us would have liked to seen a few key anchors there to make sure that this momentum is maintained. But that's just my comment. Sir?
Okay.
Oh, did you want to? Sorry, Mary Beth wants to.
I'll just make a very quick comment. One of the things Chief Morley said this morning that really resonates with me, and he said it early on, it was, we're changing Canada. And it's risky business, and it requires changing a narrative. And from my perspective, I think Indigenous and Aboriginal people here in Mi'kma'ki, for sure, we get that. We know that constitutional change is, we know that big change is required, and I think APC is working towards that, right? To work on a much broader citizenship governance level to make change. It's going to take a long time, so we're working towards that. But in the short term, there's got to be action too. So it's two perspectives simultaneously happening, and I think yes, people are still working towards changing the Constitution and changing the relationship at a higher level. But there's small steps, there's little things you have to do, and it's scary. And I don't think Canada's there yet. I don't think that, from working with the federal government as infrequently as I do, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think they're there yet. I think we are. I don't think they are.
Okay, sir.
My name's DJ Joseph. I'm the band manager at Elsipogtog First Nation, and it's been a comment that's floated around, and it was just brought up again of the closing window. And David, I think you were kind of answering it just before it was brought up again. So it kind of it prompted me to ask the question: is there, I guess, let's say the window closes, do we, or is there in the back of everybody's mind a plan B in terms of getting stuff done, right? Because I know we're on the move, and an open window kind of makes it a lot easier. But kind of thinking worst case scenario, do we have a plan B?
I thank you for that. I like Scott's comment that you know, that there is a prop for that window, and that could be a piece of legislation. I know of nobody working on that legislation. I've been involved in the major pieces of Indian legislation over the last decade, which is FinCETA, FNOGMA, the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. And Scott is absolutely correct that there's a window before the next election in order to get legislation put in. And there's a ton of work that has to go in the development of legislation. And I do not know that work is being done by anybody. Certainly, we're not doing it. The window closes. Is it over? No. We've been at this, a lot of you. Chief Terry, your whole life, your whole career has been forcing that window open in order to make change, effective change. That work will always continue. This opportunity that's been afforded us more currently with this government, I liken it to a Pandora's box. They're not going to get the cover back on that thing. There's going to be hands and fingers sticking out of there saying, we're not, you're not going to do that to us again. Can it be difficult if that window closes? Oh yeah, it'll be just like old times, where we got to fight tooth and nail to get something done. But I think, if anything, we are more determined now, and we certainly have had a taste of where we want to be, and I think that's, if everything falls to hell, at least we've got that much, that we now know that we've got to get over there. We've got to aspire to that other side and participate. We have to control ourselves, our lives.
And my response, I guess, is my plan B, because I don't think any of the plan A's that are happening right now are really making the impact that they need to make. My plan B is the youth. So the high school students, the junior high students, the elementary school students that are going to be running the country in the next 20 years are the plan that I'm banking on, I guess. And I think in Nova Scotia, and I know we're talking a lot about federal, and obviously when we're talking First Nations and Aboriginal Indigenous, we're often talking federal, but in Nova Scotia, I think there's a really great model in the tripartite discussions that are happening between the Nova Scotia government, the federal government, and First Nations governance. And in education, changing the curriculum in the provincial school system is a huge piece of that, because that's where youth and students are learning about what the issues are, they're learning about what governance is, and in Nova Scotia, in the education system right now, there's definitely some problems, but they're focusing more on governance and changing a little bit of a dialogue there so that students are learning about the Mi'kmaq people locally and learning about governance and what governance means on a broad scope. So yeah, I think that's going to be my plan A, but right now it is the plan B, is rely on the youth and start talking to them now so that when they're there and dealing with these issues, they know what the mistakes were and they don't repeat them.
Okay, so I think our time is up. I want to, if you'll join me, thank our panelists for an excellent job. A really good discussion. Thank you very much.